Welcome back to our last History Blitz video lesson. This is Reconstruction. My name is Mrs. B. Gonzalez. Let's get started. Like always, here are a couple of key points that we're going to be going over today. Reconstruction is a time period after the Civil War. Before the Civil War, you've got the time period known as the antebellum. Antebellum means before war. Then you have the Civil War, and now you have Reconstruction. So during this time period, this is when the United States planned on rebuilding the South, literally, right? Rebuilding it, because as you see there, it is destroyed, but also rebuilding it through government. Trying to see what are we going to be doing? Are we going to allow these former government officials to be back in the South? How are we going to treat the South now that the war has ended? And so there's a lot of things that happen during this time. Individuals that are going to the South to take advantage of the people there, such as carpetbaggers who were from the North and said this is a perfect opportunity to go down South and take advantage of the people who have lost their businesses and so on and so forth. You also have scalawags, which were Southerners who were on the northern side, who sided with the North. That was kind of like an insult to be called a scalawag. And so just keep all of these individuals in mind as we continue talking about what Reconstruction was. Shortly after the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln is assassinated. John Wilkes Booth ends up shooting him at Ford's Theater while he was watching a play. The next president is Andrew Johnson, and even though Andrew Johnson said, I'm going to follow exactly the plan that Lincoln had, which was allow the South to come in and be lenient, he didn't really do a good job as president because he was very hands-off. He allowed other individuals to come in and start making decisions. And so we're going to be talking about those. They're known as radical Republicans. And that time period is known as Radical Reconstruction. The Radical Republicans were a group of Northern congressmen who took control of government and they made drastic legislative policies. And what that means is they started making unreasonable laws. At least that's what the South thought, that they were unreasonable. These laws included the Civil Rights Act and Reconstruction Acts. And we'll talk a little bit more about what those are exactly. The first thing that happens, still under Lincoln when he's still alive, he passes the 13th Amendment, officially abolishing slavery. The 13th Amendment ends slavery. And so that means everyone who used to be a slave is now free. So the 13th frees slaves, abolishes slavery. So know that, keep that in mind, because there's going to be a total of 3 amendments we're going to be learning, 13, 14, 15, all having to do with slavery. The 13th Amendment frees slaves. So after they're free, the federal government says, well, we need to create some kind of organization or program that supports them. We can't just say, okay, you're free, go, right? They don't have anything. So they create the Freedmen's Bureau. This organization supports former slaves by giving them food, shelter, clothing, medicines, and also creates schools for kids to be able to start getting an education. Now, remember I mentioned the Reconstruction Acts? When these radical Republicans came over and took over, they passed these radical legislative acts. And what they did is they split the South into 5 military districts, and they literally sent the military to these districts. And former Confederate leaders were denied the ability to vote or obtain political positions. So if you used to be in the military with the Confederacy, you were not allowed to be part of government anymore. The Southern states had to form new governments and then, of course, allow former slaves to be part of that government. The South wasn't having it. They were making laws known as the Black Codes. And these Black Codes were basically laws to limit the rights of African Americans. So if we were allowing them to go to school, if we were allowing them to get a job, the South was making laws to restrict them. Like, yes, you're free, but you have to live on that side of town. Yes, you're free, but you need a pass to be able to travel. That's not really free. These codes prohibited former slaves from moving around freely, from serving in juries. They had to sign labor contracts where their former master said, yes, I'll give you a job, but these are my conditions. And of course, they were unrealistic conditions, and it was like they were back to being slaves. And even groups like the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, were formed. These groups, what they did is they used violent tactics to intimidate freedmen from actually exercising their rights, from being able to be free. And so as the North and these radical Republicans are seeing what the South is doing, they said, you know what? It's not enough for former slaves to be free. We need to make them citizens. They need to have rights, and they need to be protected by the Bill of Rights. And so the 14th Amendment grants them citizenship rights to all former slaves. So now they are not property, they are citizens. Do you remember that landmark Supreme Court case that said the opposite? Remember, Dred Scott versus Sandford said slaves are property, not citizens. Well, with the 14th Amendment, it overturned that court case and said, no, former slaves, African Americans, are citizens. So now they have rights and responsibilities as well. They were always finding ways to limit them. So what the United States decided to do is say, let's give them the right to vote. Let's guarantee them suffrage to all former slaves. Like that, they're always going to have a voice in government, so that when the South is making all these laws, they have a right to vote against these laws that they're proposing. So again, 13th, think about this, 13, 14, 15. Then remember these letters, FCV, Free Citizens Vote. 13, 14, 15. Free citizens vote. So again, the 13th Amendment, they're free. The 14th, they're citizens. The 15th, they can vote. And once they can vote, the South still was able to pass some laws like literacy tests and voting taxes. Like, in order for you to vote, you need to be able to read and write, and you need to pay a tax. Well, all of those were additional things that the South was always trying to do to limit their rights. But eventually they were able to vote for people and for them to be in Congress, such as Hiram Rhodes Revels. Hiram Rhodes Revels is the first African American to win a seat in the U.S. Congress as a member of the Senate. So remember him. He's the first African American to be part of Congress in the Senate. One of the things that ended up happening, especially as soon as African Americans are free under the 13th Amendment, is they become indebted to their former masters. This is known as sharecropping. What happens is former slaves are free now, but the only thing they know how to do is grow crops. So what the former masters did was they said, I will rent you what you need. You need a piece of land, you need seeds, you need supplies, you need tools. I will lend you all of that. You just have to promise me a piece of your crop once you're done. And so at the end, when the slaves were done and it was time to give their former masters their crops, they ended up giving everything to them and still owing them money. And so at the end of it, many of these former slaves became trapped in this cycle of debt. And so this became a long-term consequence of sharecropping. They ended up being slaves to their former masters all over again. This officially concludes our U.S. History Blitz video lessons. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this. I hope you all enjoyed it. Again, my name is Mrs. B. Gonzalez, and I guess we'll see you in our next project.